Welcome back to another edition of Check Call. Don't forget to subscribe to Check Call, the newsletter on FreightWaves.com if you haven't already. Today we welcome Dan Spitali, Vice President of Global Sales at UPS Capital. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Thanks, Barry. Happy to be here. Excited to spend some time with you today.
I am excited today. It's one of my favorite things, which is returns, which doesn't seem like it's anyone's favorite things, but it is mine because it's like the ultimate puzzle of how do you figure it out. Before we get too far into that, though, let's get some background on you and how you got started at UPS Capital.
Yeah, so journey started about 25 years ago. Started in the UPS core of the business that everybody thinks of, right? Different operation, marketing, and sales roles. So I spent about the first 10 years of my career what would be considered on the small package end of things. And then in 2009, I had an opportunity to kind of take a risk. Capital was still a younger upstart business unit at the time. Had an opportunity to move over to this side of the business, which is basically the risk management financial arm of UPS, a wholly owned business unit. And 15 years later, and probably 6 or 7 roles along the way, really anchored heavily into, again, operations, marketing, and sales. Getting ready next year to go into my 25th year, 16th year at Capital, and have the honor and pleasure of leading a sales team of 200 across the globe, across the risk management end of things, post-sale experience, and inventory intelligence. So really great opportunity, and the journey has been absolutely worth it.
I like it. It's kind of that the old classic that I like to refer to as once supply chain gets your claws around it, or gets its claws around you, you can never leave.
No, pretty much it. It's certainly would have never have thought that when I took the role as a kind of an entry-level specialist way back in 2000. You know, you're kind of a younger person and you think you know what the big picture is, and you really don't have a clue. So I was thinking about what was going to happen on Tuesday, on Monday. And you know, it's kind of worked out. So I'm super grateful for that.
Yeah, as I have a similar path. I started as I'm just a contractor. I need a job after graduation, and here we are many years later. Surprise, can't leave. I've tried, can't leave. Do you always come back?
Absolutely.
So we are gearing up for peak retail season. You know, the holidays are coming around. Everybody. I'm actually curious. I would say that obviously this is kind of a obvious thing, but it just kind of clicked in my head that e-commerce really it's Super Bowl, if you will, is like now till the end of the year. Do you think that do you guys see that same thing in like January to February for returns? Is that kind of like the peak return times? And like, what does that really look like?
Yeah, great question. And the quick answer is most certainly. So what we get, we obviously have the peak shipping season that you just referred to, and then from the UPS Capital, which is now morphed into a more holistic business unit referred to as UPS Digital, and I'll dig into that a little bit here later, but that kind of becomes our Super Bowl. So January, February, to your point, is when a lot of the reverse logistics happens. And being on the risk management insurance side of the business, we also start to see a lot of our peak related claims come through. So you have you kind of have a convergence of a few things that create quite the transaction volume. So yeah, and I think, Mary, the expansion, all social platforms seem to have a store in some capacity now. Everybody's got something, right? Like you have, of course, Amazon, you have IG shopping. Now you have TikTok, you have Newegg, you have eBay, you have all of them. Like there's so many of them. There's more that I don't know than the ones that I do, but those are just the big hitters. And it's just caused the returns landscape to blow up. And even when you hear e-commerce volume is down, peak volume is down, it's up so much considerably in the last 3 to 5 years as a result of what it looked like the previous three, that the returns just continue to be a thing. And the more customer centric and the more liberal return policies become, it's just continued, especially when it's on platform type returns where you have one spot to go do this stuff. So that the customer experience is off the charts, and it's kind of almost like buy three, and if two aren't good, just send them back. So from a customer consumer perspective, it's awesome. But as it relates to the supply chain logistics end, it does put a crunch on the business for sure. And all these different platforms and social settings, it's just created something none of us would have thought of as little as 5 years ago.
Yeah, because I mean, if you think about it, like, first of all, the TikTok shop didn't exist 5 years ago. The Instagram shop didn't exist 5 years ago. So all those brands that you see primarily advertising on social media that are doing that, like, for example, I know there's one that I see all the time. It's Halara. It's women's clothing. And you can return just about anything up to like 90 days after you buy it. And since there's no physical way to go try on clothes or see how they fit or anything like that, you just buy a size you think you might need and then another one. And then whatever one doesn't work, you send back. And if it's free returns, then there's no skin off my nose. But then that shipper has to then figure out, okay, well, how do I get all that stuff back? Because it's not like it's not like I'm shipping it to, like San Francisco and everybody's picking it up from San Francisco. No, I have San Francisco, Austin, Boston, Chicago, Fargo, North Dakota. So there's not necessarily like a good central point. I will say I have started seeing like an interface pop up where they take like a whole bunch of e-commerce returns and kind of manage it from that, but they pick it up you drop it off at like a UPS store from a customer. So I'm sure like we'll see a lot more of those type of things grow to just kind of consolidate stuff. But it is very interesting just kind of knowing the logistics side of thing, and then also as a consumer seeing all the different ways that like they try to make it easy for the customer to do those returns.
100%. So there was a couple stats that really stood out to me as I'm preparing kind of to sit with you today. And um, basically 4 out of every 10 merchants, 15% or more of their orders are going to have a return associated with it. So you think about it, and then you look at it from a luxury good perspective, which really, again, 5 years ago, it was locked down in reference to what you can return with a luxury good. And now you're looking at more than half of luxury good merchants allocate a minimum of $100,000 just for returns, just in a given peak season. So it's become something that is now not a nice to have; it's a need to have. It's table stakes. And in our pre-show conversation, like when somebody really figures that out, the LVMHs of the world and the Bulgaris of the world and the Guccis and all of them, like they're in the business too. So I found that was interesting when you start to connect luxury merchants to such a high volume of reverse logistics, which was really kind of like, I don't know what you're talking about, just as little as 5 years ago, come into the store and do it. So yeah, just a couple of stats that I found really interesting.
That is really interesting, especially from that luxury perspective, because as you mentioned, like luxury has always been seen as like this, like up on a pedestal where the rules don't apply, it's just kind of you get what you get and like, you know, you get what you get. You don't get to have an opinion about it. Um, and I mean, I've even seen somewhere like you have to buy a certain amount of products to be like that you don't want just to be qualified for something that you do want, which is insane, but like to each his own. If it brings you joy, like who am I to do that? But yeah, I think that it's interesting now because the reverse logistics, which I have long since said the first person to figure out a solution for it, like a kind of comprehensive universal solution could potentially be our first trillionaire. But I think that this is now an everyman problem instead of like just, oh, it's for the Amazons, the Walmarts, the Targets, them to figure out. It's every single retailer needs, even like your small businesses that do, online shopping, or I've seen some like boutiques that do like Facebook Live things. There's a lot of creativity there, but no matter what, if it's getting shipped to somebody, you do have to accommodate this reverse logistics problem, which is, a very real problem.
Yeah, I think the other part too, to your point, is that you get into the. I'm certainly not a psychologist, but you get into the consumer psychology of things. The liberal nature and the customer experience associated with being accepting and almost invoking the return to happen has created just a huge amount of impulse buying as well. And it's like the worst thing that can happen is I spend this $500 and I return 400 of it because you said I could. And you just start seeing that take off, especially this time of year, during the peak season. And you stock up on certain things, and come January, didn't need it. They said I could return it, and I'm going to return it. So yeah, it's created quite the shift from a consumer perspective. And I think, from our side, the UPS side, logistically speaking, but also, the UPS digital side, where we're really anchored heavily into the post-sale experience, which obviously is fully encompassing of returns. But with that is the risk mitigate of it all, especially as it relates to luxury goods. It's a couple of worlds colliding for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's, I mean, I don't know that much about like luxury goods supply chain. I'll be the first person to say, I don't know how Hermes, moves their bags across the world. But it is interesting that, they are faced with those problems that that you've seen your Walmarts, your Targets, that you've seen everyone deal with for a long time. And I mean, it's just kind of, it goes to show that no matter what business it is, you're still gonna have the same problems. You're still gonna have to go, how do I handle my returns? How do I handle this? And I think, especially, because I think the TikTok shop has only been around for a couple years, but I mean, it's already started now. Everywhere you go, you can't go more than 10 seconds without saying, oh, 10 things that must have, 10 things you must have for the holidays, 10 things you must have for Christmas, like the best outfits for Christmas. Like, it's like there's such a cultivation of like buying now, that it's kind of like, well, when it shows up, you're like, did I actually really want this? Or did I just buy it because I saw it on social media? And that, I think, is something that, as we see this evolution of social media and kind of that, those like, oh, just follow this link. I think as we see that, I'm curious to see how that affects the e-commerce supply chain in the long term.
Yeah. Last point regarding the mid and the long term. So the game is changing quickly with the onset of the Temu and the Sheins of the world as well. And now you have Amazon that's responding. Um, Granted, lower value, right? But that doesn't reduce the likelihood of returns just because it's lower value. In fact, it might invoke more. So this is really like, while it's already a big deal, it's getting bigger by the day.
Yeah. So that being said, we have this mountain that we're staring up at of how do you handle returns? How do you handle, e-commerce from a logistics standpoint, but also still keeping your customers happy? Because changing return policies where you have only like maybe 10 days or something to return it might not necessarily be the answers, because that's going to really anger a lot of people. But like, how do you see those changes evolving, and kind of what's kind of that short term, maybe midterm future that you see for, that return logistics aspect?
So the merchants are going to continue to follow the voice of customer,
Mhm.
and we kind of talked a little bit about that. It'll get more deeply ingrained in the e-com social platforms of the world, um, and it's going to create, just my opinion, maybe some unforeseen challenges in, not just from a logistics perspective in supply chain, but also within their own ecosystems. And what I mean is how do they scale their returns management process, which is going to take It's going to take people, it's going to take process, but it's also going to take performance metrics. And that isn't something that, while there are some out there that do it really, really well, this has not been a prioritization historically for many merchants, in particular in the SMB space. The larger ones of the world, yeah, I mean, it's you get the big boxes, you get the the Best Buys and the Costco's. That's a different game, but that only makes up roughly 10% of business in the United States. This is a 90% plus of what happens here from an economic perspective is happening from SMB and middle market type customers that A, don't have the bandwidth, B, probably don't have the skill sets because it requires more people, which requires more budget. So by following the irony of it, by following the voice of customer and continuing to make the return process about as customer friendly as possible, it does create logistical challenges, as we spoke about from a supply chain perspective. But for them, the challenges could be greater as it relates to how are you going to now go to market with returns as a healthy part of your portfolio, because you have to be able to back it up. And I think that's where you're going to see some of the merchants, in particular the SMB middle market spaces, struggle. And we started to see it a little bit. I mean, just the cost of return shipping is ultimately going to get to the point where it's 50% of what they allocate in a year just for transportation. And you have $200,000 transportation customers that now need to essentially double that budget just for returns. There's a lot there to unpack for them.
Because I know that there's some, like, obviously each retailer, each business, each shipper handles things their own ways, but those that don't offer free returns, I see struggling to, like, if they start charging consumers for returns, then you're losing that profit on the revenue side. And then, some with shorter windows, they'll see people, maybe harass customer service more because the return policy changed. And so it really kind of comes down to what is, and that's something that you brought up that's incredibly, like, fantastic, is that what is that investment that you are able to sink in to handle your returns process? Because like you said, not like a small e-commerce shipper that maybe uses for example, the TikTok shop to sell something that they make out of their home, or like maybe screen printed t-shirts. It might be like a 3 to 4 person operation. They don't have the ability to have a team to sit there and handle everything. So it's just kind of you kind of have to cut your losses, but they also might not have enough revenue to hire a company to come in and do it. So they just kind of have to manage it the best they can. Whereas, your large shippers like a Target or a Walmart, those are going to be easier for them to implement some sort of, or to have a team dedicated to returns, because honestly, they have a much larger budget and they have a lot easier way to do that. But not every shipper that we see out there that's using e-commerce is the Targets, the Walmarts, the Amazon, those large shippers. A lot of them are those small to medium-sized businesses that are that I think is kind of a completely different ground that they are on compared to even 3 or 4 years ago.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think returns already has for some, but it has the propensity and likelihood for even again this SMB middle market customers to require just the whole specialist approach, not the generalist approach. Because while it's moving and while it's let's call it logistically inclined, right? It's different. The value is different, and I think the other part of this that's going to come into play, Mary, is that you start talking about returns management as its own team, as its own department, but also what comes with that sometimes that gets lost in the shuffle until you're bitten pretty hard by it is fraud. The create a label, put it on an empty box, return it, and I'm going to get my money back. And that's something here at UPS Digital where we look at both the front and the back end of the risk, and whether it's precious metals moving from a Costco, or if it's high tech moving from Best Buy, the likelihood of fraud now versus even 18 months ago is immense. And we're starting to see 4 out of every 10 merchants now are offering some type of fraud protection for their customers with return, and that costs money. That's a different type of risk mitigant that is much different than just the traditional insurance. So you go back to the whole risk management department, if you will. And the ironic thing of this is the people that do figure it out with returns are going to do it with tech. And hypothetically speaking, tech is supposed to streamline and help to, in some cases, reduce headcount. In this instance, it might create a need to increase it.
Yeah. And I think that because a lot of times people say, oh, I'm going to get this automation and it's going to solve all my problems. I'm going to be able to basically remove an entire department. But then it frees up those people that you can then allocate them to another area that actually needs help. So that's why I like the idea of tech, and I like the idea of having automation and improving things, because it doesn't necessarily mean that you're automatically going to reduce headcount. It means that the headcount you have is working more strategically to actually solve problems versus handle those day-to-day things that, some machine learning code thing can handle with very little issue.
Well, you bring a good point, and I talk quite a bit about this with our sales leadership team and our sales producers that are all over the globe. And anytime new tech comes out, regardless of what it is, there's some that quickly move that we're doing this because you want to replace me. And I think your point is spot on. It's not so much what I encourage them to think about is, don't think about AI or machine learning or tech replacing you. Think about the people that learn how to use it replacing you. They're very different things. It's not the tech replacing you. It's the person that embraced it and learned how to use it better than you. And that's the same thing with returns management with some of these merchants, is that it's the people that, if they find the 4 people that could do it rather than having the 8 that would do it without it, that's going to be utopia for them.
Yeah. Because there's always going to be those exceptions that you can't, that automation can't handle. There's always going to be those exceptions. There's always going to be the things that you physically need somebody to intervene on. But that should be what that person does most of the time versus the day-to-day automation stuff, because people have brains and they need to be utilized more.
Agreed.
So, that being said, we have a couple minutes left. So, final thoughts. What advice do you give to either to merchants, shippers, anyone that's looking to kind of balance that customer satisfaction plus costs plus sustainability, and also kind of still have an overall positive returns process for every single person involved?
Yeah. So each transaction, especially on the return side, right? Because this is quote unquote what you told me I could do. Each transaction is an opportunity to move your NPS upward or downward. It's kind of the choice of the merchant, right? But transforming the process to be customer centric, to drive customer experience, and ultimately what that means for NPS is sometimes grossly understated, because it does really matter. Especially when there's dollars associated to what should be coming back to me from what I'm returning. So to gain a competitive edge from a merchant perspective, embrace returns management, budget accordingly for returns management, or you will erode your CX and your NPS. And from a peak perspective, start early, don't wait. That would be some advice I would give from a merchant perspective in that regard, from a timing standpoint. But to really foster loyalty, deepen relationships, and really take CX to the next level, it's no longer a nice to have. It's table stakes. The consumer expects it. And if you tell me I can't do it, I have probably at least 100 choices that will, and I could get a similar product. So I'm just going to go in that direction. So embrace it, plan for it, do what you say when you say you're going to do it. Those would be the very simple, but I think high ROI items for merchants to consider as it relates to the return management process.
I think you have hit every single nail on that head as hard as one can. It's not rocket science, but it is rocket science at the same time. It's something that you can't just forget about. You have to plan for now. You can't just say, we'll deal with it later, because dealing with it later will cost you an insane amount of money.
Yep, agree.
All right. So, for regular listeners of the show, this is usually the time where we dive into the hot dog as sandwich question. However, we have crested 150 episodes. We have moved into new uncharted territory. We're giving the people what they want, and that is a new question. Dan, are you ready for this?
Mary, I've been preparing for this for 2 weeks, and I still couldn't come up with the right answer, so I'm just going to see what I can do.
All right. Dan, if you had to live in a food-themed house, what food would it be made of?
It's without question pizza.
Okay. All right.
Sometimes I can't get out of my own way. I'm originally from Chicago. I live here in Atlanta now, but I'm from Chicago. While deep dish is the first thing that comes to mind for people, that is true. I would consider it more of maybe the touristy pizza in Chicago. Good nonetheless. The what would consider tavern style thin crust, crispy crackerish type pizza is real Chicago neighborhood pizza. And it's hands down my favorite food. So if I could build my house of food, it would be made of pizza for sure.
Okay, I have a follow-up. Cold pizza or warm pizza?
That's a very fair question. I think it would depend on what decade of my life I was in. But I'm going to go with warm for now. But in a pinch and in a rush, there's nothing like a good cold piece of pizza.
You know, as someone who does love cracker pizza herself, it's the super thin. Everybody hates it, but I love it. There's something to be said for the structural integrity of a house made out of cracker pizza.
I agree. I mean, it not only does it look great, but it will make you scratch your head of like, how can you make a pizza on that cracker?
Exactly. Dan, if anyone has questions about your pizza cracker building or returns, where can they find you outside the show?
Yeah. So on LinkedIn, feel free to reach out. Pretty active on LinkedIn. Certainly multiple times a day, probably once, twice a week, maybe posting. Feel free to reach out. Happy to get back with you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mary. Appreciate the opportunity. Have a great day.
Don't forget to subscribe to the newsletter on freightwaves.com/checkcalls. See you on the internet.